They want their characters to look so good. They want the dialogue to be well written. They want to feel what the characters are saying. They want a feature set that's just ridiculously deep.
That's Cliff Bleszinski, renowned video game designer and the author of Control Freak.
To ship a AAA game, it's a miracle that a video game ever ships. It's a ridiculous miracle that a AAA game ever even makes it out the door and makes money. It's a risky business.
I'm Michael Mogill, founder and CEO of Crisp, the nation's #1 law firm growth company. I've built my business through practice, not theory. Crisp started with just $500 to my name and has grown to over 8 figures in revenue over the last few years, earning a spot on the Inc. 500 list of the fastest growing private companies in America. Our approach has been to take everything we've learned about generating massive growth within our own organization and help the country's most ambitious and committed law firm owners do the same for theirs. In each episode of this podcast, I sit down with innovative market leaders from the legal industry and beyond to learn from those who thrive in the face of adversity, challenge the status quo, and define what it means to be a true game changer. Today, we're revisiting one of our most popular episodes from the podcast where I sat down with Cliff Bleszinski to discuss how to combat complacency when redefining what's possible, the risks and rewards of relentless obsession, and his epic adventure making some of the most transformational and genre-defining video games.
It's not just making a great world. It's not just making a great game or characters. And yes, making money and being known for it. But when people are willing to scar their fucking body with something that you came up with, that is the most flattering thing in the world.
That's coming up on the Game Changing Attorney podcast. Before we begin today's episode, I want to remind you that we aren't beholden to any sponsors or run any ads on this podcast. This allows us to present all of our episodes raw and unfiltered. I'm not going to push any made-to-order meal services on you or try to save you any money on your car insurance. That being said, I have one small request. If you receive any value from this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. Pay the fee so we can keep this podcast free. Cliff, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So we've had a number of interesting guests on this podcast. This I'm extremely excited about, just being a fellow gamer. And just when I was reading your book, it was almost like reliving a version of my childhood, but then kind of hearing, well, this is how it all happened. This is how it all went down. So to give you a bit of an intro, like today, you're one of the most renowned video game designers on the planet. You played a visionary role in some of the most successful games in history. And now you've got published author to add to your list of accolades, as well as investor, restaurateur, and so much more. I want to talk about the book, and we'll discuss it probably throughout. But I'm curious, in your book, what compelled you to write it in the first place?
For those who don't know, I've been making video games since I was like a kid. And then I realized I wanted to get in the industry because I wanted to make great games. I wanted to be well known for it, and I wanted to pay my bills and be able to eat. And I managed to accomplish that over the course of 25 years. But it was quite the journey. Being a fan of Space Invaders when I was a kid in the 80s and seeing it on my friend's TV. I was 6 years old, and I thought, oh my God, you can move things on your TV. I find that really, really interesting. And then set to work for the next, 30 some odd years. And then I wrapped it up. I was with Epic Games, Gears of War, Fortnite, all that stuff for 20 years. I took a little bit of time off. And then I had my own game studio called Boss Key Productions. It survived for about 3.5 years, put out a really, really solid hero shooter called Lawbreakers. Didn't do well, ultimately. Threw out a kind of a half-baked battle royale called Radical Heights, which had a lot of promise, but ultimately we didn't get the users that we wanted. And the studio wound up folding a few years ago, which basically broke me for like a year, because all those years of winning with Epic Games, and then I had my first big L on my forehead, for lack of a better joke. And then I just felt the need to just start word vomiting the text onto Microsoft's Word, and it just started coming out of me. Basically took 4 years from the inception of being like, I'm gonna write the great American novel, and start typing on my damn keyboard, to getting a publishing deal with Simon & Schuster through my agency, and then actually seeing it come to light. And, my advice about writing a memoir is I would advise anybody to not do it, because it's a lot of work. And as a gamer, there's a trope in video games where we fight ourselves, and in some of the Zelda games, you fight Dark Link. There's been so many games that do that. And for me, it was that. It was facing the highest highs of my entire life and the lowest lows, and putting it all out there, just unabashed and without any shame. And just, this is me. And if you want to read it, cool. And if you like video games, I think you'll like it. Even if you don't play video games, I hope people will enjoy the story of a little nerd who just wanted to be somebody in this world,
Yeah. And, it seems like there was quite a few pivotal moments in your life, one of which was just getting your hands on your first Atari. And I think many of our listeners, they have experience with that. And while many of them may have responded, hey, this is fun, this is cool, you write about a very different type of response that you had when you first had one.
Well, I mean, we all had that one neighbor, I'd like to believe, growing up, that was the spoiled one, right? And for me, this was two phases. The first phase was a kid at the end of the street. His dad owned like a performance racing shop where you could take your car and upgrade it and all that stuff. And he's a single dad. He divorced the kid's mom. But his response was to just shower them with gifts. So they had this basement where they had like a real life pinball machine. They had the Atari 2600, the whole 9 yards, pool table. And, a friend of mine taught me years ago, if you have kids, to have the coolest house. That way all the kids in the neighborhood are playing in your basement, so you know exactly what the fuck they're doing. So they're not over at Joe and Susan's house drinking beer when they're 12 years old, right? So keep an eye on the little kids. But Space Invaders, when I saw, the different types of invaders, just slowly descending on, the main ship and, the ones that were doing little kind of jumping jacks animation, we were just enthralled as children. And I knew from that moment that would be my destiny, that would be what I wanted to do. I mean, I was in drama a bit, I was like, Michael Darling and Peter Pan in 6th grade and community theater and things like that. But I always came back to my first love, which was games, which was manipulating images on TV in order to escape the shitty reality which we've been given to live in.
But what do you think differentiates someone who enjoys playing games, because obviously there's quite a few of them, versus someone who wants to make games?
The person who plays games wants to escape the real world. They want to get away from the struggles of the day-to-day life that they live. The person who makes the games wants to be the one who's the architect of the Matrix. They're the ones who want to be the dungeon master. They're the ones who are saying, hey, come on, we're going to be, going on a journey here. It goes back to the, when we were cavemen and we gathered around the fireplace and tell the stories, ghost stories and stories of battles and romance and things like that. We're the ones who are kind of leading the breadcrumb for the players to escape that reality. And the very first time when I was able to put graphics on screen and then manipulate a character that I had put together, it was one of the biggest highs that I've ever had in my life that I have since spent decades chasing. And, to make a video game is incredibly gratifying, but it's also a ton of work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to talk about just even your journey to Epic Games and to meeting Tim Sweeney and just how they heard about you, how they learned about you. And this is, I was thinking back as you were writing about this and talking about like shareware and IRC, just kind of the old school ways in which games used to be distributed, if you could speak to that.
Back in the day, before we had broadband and we had really, really good internet, mostly until it craps out arbitrarily. We had, our old modems, which would make that sounded like two robots fucking in order to connect with the phone, like, right? And then what would happen is, you go into BBSs where somebody would actually host on their computer. People could dial into their computer and chat, message boards, things like that, play simple online games, but also download demos for games. This was the era of shareware in the early 90s. Where it was the ultimate try before you buy. It was free to play before free to play became a thing. If you like episode 1, give us a little bit of money. You've had a little bit of fun. Give us $20-$30 for the rest of it. Just send in an actual physical check. This was long before PayPal. Send in the check and we'll send you, the 3 discs, maybe a nice little instruction booklet and things like that. And then you get to be a supporter of the game and actually buy it. And so then I, wound up putting out some 2D kind of adventure point and click games where I need to figure out how to get the key to get to the door so I can save this baby dragon from an evil wizard. And then later on, I've always been a fan of the 2D platform style games like Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog and whatnot. And I made a game called Jackrabbit, where you were a little green rabbit with a gun fighting against turtles, evil turtles that had kidnapped the princess, of course, because that's what they always do. And it was the tortoise and the hare 3,000 years later. And so to back up for a quick second, as per Tim Sweeney and Mark Rain and Epic Games had actually put out a call for talent in one of their games, Jill of the Jungle, which was another kind of, 2D side-scrolling platform game like Mario. And I saw that, and I had been making my adventure games at that point, and I packaged them up in a little, mailer envelope, and I mailed them to Rockville, Maryland. And next thing I know, I got a phone call from Epic trying to convince me to come work for them. A lot of people are like, wow, you're so lucky. And I believe to some extent in life, you make your luck. I can't remember who said the quote, but half of success is just showing up and just being there. It's the whole Kevin Smith adage about Hollywood, where he says somehow in Hollywood, you can kind of fail upwards. Again, to use all these cheesy quotes, as Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right?
Another point that to mention is Epic Games at the time is not the Epic Games that we know today. I mean, this is not like a multi-billion-dollar company. They were just getting their start.
It just amazes me how people have such short-term memories in regards to not knowing the history of, the various entertainment entities that they wind up enjoying these days, be it, United Artists, be it Epic Games and Fortnite and things like that. And Epic has a long and storied history. And I think there's a larger topic there that one could talk about in regards to the history of video games. And there are people that are making the National Video Game History Museum. I think they're out in Dallas, if I recall. And we live in a world of online, always on games as services, whereas, you can play a game like Fortnite or you can play a game like Valorant or Apex Legends. But the problem is once those games have run their life course, then they pull the servers and you cannot physically play the game anymore. And so a little bit of video game history is kind of vanishing, which kind of, makes me sad. But the thing is everybody plays games these days. You could be a hardcore player playing Call of Duty and, for tons of money if you're Twitch streaming or if you're a pro player, or you could just be a person who downloads and plays a mobile game on your phone. Regardless, if any device was built for work, people will find a way to fuck off and entertain themselves on it.
Yep. Yeah. So, and I want to talk about like the time kind of like when you joined Epic and then after Jackrabbit. Now, at the time, you guys are competing against killers. This was like John Carmack, John Romero, you've got Doom, you've got Wolfenstein, you've got Quake, like all these games coming out. What was that experience like when you guys were deciding to even put together Unreal?
It was Rocky Balboa versus Apollo Creed, and then it was later Creed versus Drago's son. We were the underdogs. We were the David versus Goliath. And we always found ways to zig when everyone else zagged. I remember I was making my little platform, Jackrabbit games, and then, Wolfenstein came out and then Doom came out. Tim and Mark at Epic Games were like, holy shit, this is the future. Everything's going to wind up being 3D eventually. And there's still plenty of games that have that kind of 2D pixel side-scrolling platform game. They're the kind of games that I love on my Nintendo Switch, like Cyber Shadow and things like that. But at the end of the day, 3D is where we realized things were going. And it was, slowly but surely working on their next big thing, which was a game called Quake, the latest iteration of legendary game programmer John Carmack's id Tech engine. And we were working on a game that would be called Unreal. And we looked at, the Quake test that came out, and it was all these spooky, dark, gray, brown dungeons and Cthulhu-type creatures. And we're like, let's make a beautiful alien planet with large, open environments and colored lighting and just gorgeous environments that the player could kind of get lost in for hours on end. And wound up making, a classic game that a lot of people don't remember because the engine side of business for Epic, where people can give them a chunk of money or points or royalties on their project, and then they get a pre-built, prefabricated engine where they can build their game in, half the time that it would normally take. And Epic realized this would be a very lucrative business model. And so then they wound up making the Unreal Engine this huge thing. And a lot of people forget that it all started with a game that was called Unreal.
Yeah. And a year later, which I actually want to talk about this in a bit, just the fact that Unreal came out and then a year later Unreal Tournament came out. Like that's just even the development cycle is amazing. But when you were working on Unreal Tournament, you gave some really great advice to your design team. And I was reading in the book, you said that you can't please all the people all the time. So why not just make most of the people insanely happy some of the time? And if you could speak to how that influenced the game.
So when the first Unreal came out, the multiplayer, the deathmatch, the capture the flag modes, it was completely broken. The network code was just totally shot. And then, we put ourselves together and we were going to put out a pack that was basically going to be a way to play multiplayer offline. Because this was, again, we're dealing with the mid to late 90s where not everybody even had internet. People might have actually had a dial-up connection, the rope going back to the robots fucking, but, they didn't have a lot of broadband and everything back then. So you couldn't assume that people could connect. So what we had were what we called bots, where it was the player's way of just running around these maps and shooting what the player felt like were human opponents, but they actually were just controlled by the PC and by the artificial intelligence. And that was enough for us to kind of bridge that gap into, the multiplayer world. So people would play against the artificial intelligence and be like, hey, I wonder what it would be like to have a good internet connection and then, actually shoot people in the face with these sci-fi crazy weapons. And Deathmatch came out of id Software, but then Epic took it to the next level. And Unreal Tournament was developed in just a little bit over a year because we had the established base of what Unreal was. So we could just slot in, upgraded characters, upgraded weapons, fixed netcode, upgraded new maps, and we could just make the engine shine better than ever and make, one of the games of the year. And I believe 1999, I think was when it won Game of the Year award. And that's when Epic really started hitting their stride. Then it was Unreal Tournament 2003, Unreal Tournament 2004, Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and then all the way beyond to the Gears of War franchise.
Even just when we talk about multiplayer, I think this is something a lot of people take for granted now. So way back in the day, just even the transition to multiplayer, and I think originally even with LAN parties, there was a time in my life where I organized a LAN party at my home and I had a bunch of people invited and we were sponsored by 3DFX and they sent over a bunch of graphics cards and they sent swag, like hats and shirts.
You're getting the nerd cred right now, man.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, so then my mom finds out, and she's like, what is this LAN party, right? She found out that it's a bunch of grown men coming over, bringing their computers over to our house, into our basement, and we're all just connecting through just Ethernet cables. And she said, hell no. So the party never happened.
What would she rather you be doing meth behind Borders bookstore?
she shut it down. But I'd love it if you could speak to what that experience was like of just going from LAN connections to then dial up, and what a game changer multiplayer was at the time.
Back in the day, do you remember GameSpy? For those of you who don't remember GameSpy, like when you wanted to play a game, you had to go to somebody's server, that was hosting the game. And then GameSpy was a browser, one of the first ones to do it, where you could just sit there and have a whole list of these servers. You could sort it by, okay, there's 32 people in this server, so I can join that and get a game. Or this game has a low ping, so the latency is going to be low, so I can actually press the fire button and see my weapon fire when I shoot the damn thing, as opposed to hitting it and waiting a second for it to shoot and things like that. That coming back and going back to LAN parties. So when I was working on Unreal Tournament, I was living in Southern California, and GameSpy's offices were in Orange County, Southern California. So they would have their own LAN parties there. They called them Bastards Beatdown. And so I'd pack up my IBM PC, load it into my Saturn, my 1991 Saturn. Yeah, first car. I'd drive down there and I'd go to those all-night LAN parties, and we'd play Quake 2 and all these other games, and we'd have a blast and play side by side, elbow to elbow. And we were all, for lack of a better term, gentlemen. We were cordial and polite to each other. Once you add in the mask of anonymity, it's getting exponentially worse with social media and politics and things like that. But suddenly people find the confidence to say things they wouldn't normally say, for better or for worse. So as great as online gaming is, as wonderful as it is, as huge as it is, there's also that infamous dark side of it, of people calling you every name in the book, from racial slur to sexist and misogynistic comments. So my advice, to also, side note, for parents, going back to your mother, if you have kids, you'd rather have them in the basement playing the game as opposed to God knows where.
Yep. Now, in talking about just the new Unreal coming out almost every single year, and then we'll talk about, of course, Gears of War, but I'd love it if you could just share what goes into making a AAA game. And you can feel free to define what a AAA game is, but just in terms of what team size looks like, what the budget's required, how much time it takes, and I would say a AAA game in the 21st century.
Yeah, I was going to say, what year are we talking about, right? Yep. Are we talking about a AAA game in the year 2000, you're looking at 30, 40 people, right? Now we're in, for those of you who don't know AAA, we're talking about your Grand Theft Autos, your Call of Duties, your God of War, your Last of Us, your Uncharted, all that stuff. $60, $70 console game, often PC too as well, of course, right? But all the graphics are insane. The feature set is robust. Players expect so much out of this $60 or $70, rightfully so, because they're the consumers. They're putting down their hard-earned money for this product. But, when I'm asked how much does it cost or how many people does it take to make a game, and at least you specified one variable, you specified one parameter, AAA. Because I've had so many people say, what's it take to make a game? And it's like, one of my biggest pet peeves in life is leaving out variables. It's like, well, I'm going to build a house. What does it take to build a house? And I'm like, how big's your house? What kind of materials are you using? What kind of location are we at? Are we in, New York? Are we in Boise, Idaho? Is it a lakefront property? Is it oceanfront? Is it multi-use? Is it and there's so many variables that are involved there. So the thing is for AAA, if you're looking at, again, to find a control there, to look at a game like Uncharted or to look at recent, Call of Duties and things like that, you're looking at, the main studio, 100 plus developers at least, plus also the Hydra development cycle or style that, people like Ubisoft will do, where they'll do the next Far Cry game, or they'll do the next Assassin's Creed, and they'll have Morrisville, North Carolina, Red Storm work on some part of it. Then they'll have, their team in Toronto work on some, the team in Montreal work on some, then the team in Seattle work on some, to kind of do this Voltron, this Transformer Combiner Devastator, where they put all the teams together in order to hopefully make a AAA game. And they still ship with bugs. You can put 500 people in tests on any of these AAA games for 2 years, and bugs will still slip through. And that's the sad reality of the fact that the users are the ones often tasked with finding this after they spend $60 or $70 on AAA, which is why the games that I play these days are kind of mid-tier independent games that were done by 20 or 30 people, because they don't have a lot of bugs and I can play through them in 3 days and be happy with my experience.
Yeah. Well, and the scope just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I'm not just talking about open world games. It's linear games too. I wouldn't say who's to blame for this, but what's causing this? Is just player expectations? They always want the graphics better. They want the narrative better. Everything just continues to grow in scale, or is it something else?
No, it's the whole joke: better, faster, softer, wetter, right? And with expectations, people want their characters to look so good. They want the dialogue to be well written. They want to feel what the characters are saying. They want feature set that's just ridiculously deep, from, they want it to have a battle royale online mode, but they want a regular team deathmatch, but they want to capture the flag, but they also want last man standing, but they also want a mod community with it. They want the players to be able to make their own versions of the game. They want an online community. And then when it comes to marketing, you not only have to spend millions of dollars in order to get, in the NCAA finals, for your ads to hit, or, Super Bowl ads. You also have to win over Twitch streamers and YouTubers and TikTokers and things like that. And then have a viral campaign where you hide things that are relics from the game in the real world, and people put YouTube videos, going to find it online. There's so much that goes into making a hit world and hit game in this era that you're not going to see a lot of new original worlds, original IPs. You're going to see a lot of the same brands because the risk factors involved are ridiculous in this day and age to ship a AAA game. It's a miracle that a video game ever ships. It's a ridiculous miracle that a AAA game ever even makes it out the door and makes money. It's a risky business.
Can you speak to that? Because I agree. I think it's absolutely amazing. And you look at even like a company like Rockstar, and we'll see like whenever Grand Theft Auto 6 comes out, right? Obviously, Grand Theft Auto 5 has made it so you're playing on like your Xbox 360 and then like, you know, your 2-3 more generations of consoles. But now with these massive teams and how long it takes to get the next iteration out, even Red Dead Redemption and, you know, in games like that, why is it such a miracle that a game ships?
Well, because you're dealing with the ultimate blend of art and science, right? You not only have the programmers who can sit there, they want to type away for 14 to 16 hours a day. Then you have an artist who classically trained can paint Boris Vallejo or Brahms style paintings. You know, if you're doing a card game, they can do amazing fantasy art and they're a quirky type. And then you have 3D modeler who can build a character out of 8 million bazillion triangles. They sit there, you know, making sure the eyebrows look right and make sure the earlobes look real and the fingers look right, which AI art has yet to get right. And then the animators that are going to breathe life into these characters, they're kind of digital puppet masters. You have the ultimate combination of all of these different disciplines. And then they all have to get together and learn how to communicate. Because the type of person who wants to sit behind their computer screen for 14 to 16 hours a day isn't necessarily the best communicator. They're not the best in meetings. They're not the best in emails. They just want to sit there and craft beautiful, sleek, well-crafted code. You know, the artist wants to make character models that are tight and well put together. And then to actually interact with each other is scary to them. I've been in rooms where I've seen two programmers sitting back to back, you know, emailing back and forth about a subject that we could just turn around and be like, hey, the blue gun, come on, can we make it stronger? Like, it's not that fucking hard. So that's another factor that we add into all of it. So it is really a miracle that games ship. And these are brains, mind you, that could be curing cancer. They could be working on, you know, self-driving cars. They could be doing all sorts of things, but instead they choose to make video games for better or for worse. So yes, it is a miracle that games ship, especially when you consider the budgets, the player expectations, the types of personalities that are involved in getting them out the door.
Yeah. So when you couple player expectations along with just how long these take, the size of the teams, I don't know if this is a hot button topic for you, but I'd love your thoughts on crunch in the video game industry. I know that different development teams are now approaching this a little bit differently, but just the long hours, what it takes, especially as you're approaching the last few months and, you know, when a game's about to ship, do you have to crunch? What are your thoughts?
It's a very hotly debated topic in the industry. There's crunch for the sake of crunch, which I think is bullshit, right? There's also sympathy crunch. This one department, you know, the online team, you know, struggling with packet loss or something, I don't know. And so they have to work some weekend hours in order to make sure the bugs are fixed. Should the artist have to stay at work? Well, I don't necessarily know that that's a good thing. A lot of developers have no problem with crunch because they love what they do. But once it's forced, as I was saying a little while ago, you know, you take your average programmer or artist and they'd be happy to work 14 hours a day because they'd be sitting at their computer regardless. But once you start adding in, you know, developers that get a little bit older, maybe they're 30, they have a significant other at home, they have kids, they start to really learn what's important in life. Yeah, you may have a career. You may want to put in the hours in order to make decent money to eat and take care of your family. But at some point, where are your priorities in life? And so what I tell developers, as with any business negotiation, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. So negotiate a good salary, make sure if you can get stock or stock options, see if there's a bonus plan, you know, good health care. So if you're going to be working those hours, make sure you're taken care of. But there are some studios where it's just bad planning leads to crunch time. And that is something I think could be managed, can be mitigated, and can be dealt with in the industry. And there's other times where sometimes it just is necessary. And that's just the truth of the business. You know, you also hear stories about film crews that have been shooting for 16 hours at a time. You know, it does happen in other industries as well. The key is to make sure that people get compensated for it and take good care of them, create a good working environment beyond just like, hey, we have Funyuns in the kitchen. You know, you need to make sure you have a positive working environment. People feel like their voices are heard. I tried being CEO for 3.5 years at my studio, Boss Key. I was average at best at being CEO. I believe a good CEO has to be, you know, a sociopath to some extent. But yeah, it's a tough business. People get into it because they love it. They want to be by their computers, but there's a point where too much of a good thing can be bad, and crunch can really have an adverse effect on people's stress levels, their blood pressure, their health, their mental health, and their anxiety. And I think it's one of those things the industry needs to continue to take a good, long, hard look at and make sure they mitigate it whenever possible.
Yeah. Well, and I think another topic that you're very outspoken about is just in the game industry. I mean, there's a lot of dudes, right? And I mean, there's more women now than there used to be. And I know you've been big on just making it the type of environment that women want to be a part of. And then also there's a lot of incredible women. I mean, your wife, I mean, I don't know if you would have met her had she not been in the game industry.
Yeah, I mean, I have video games to thank for introducing me to the love of my life. And going back for a quick second to the book, what ultimately winds up being a love story about my love of video games and falling in love and meeting the love of my life with Lauren. And then ultimately learning how to love myself and be comfortable in my own skin. But going back to diversity in the industry, it's like the majority of the people that I worked over the years, it was always dudes. And then for a while when I was at Epic Games, I was responsible for hiring. And, I'd get the resume and 9 times out of 10, it was Joe, John, Rick, whatever. I'd sit across from the talented person, I'd interview them, and there just were not a lot of non-white dude applicants. I'm not sure where or why that is. I don't know how that actually happened. I think one of the factors involved in regards to not a lot of women being involved in the industry is the lack of encouraging STEM when it comes to young women in the world. It goes back to, you look at those shirts that are sold at Target for gender roles. You look at, the young dude shirt, the little boy shirt. It's like, gonna kick ass and be a CEO. And the girls once say, let's go shopping. And you're like, okay, how about let's become a teacher or let's become an astronaut or do something interesting. And so I think those roles are very tightly defined. And I think also, it's very much a boys' club. It's been getting better the last 10 to 15 years, but to some extent, it really is like that. And there's a certain amount of dudes are going to be dudes, but at some point, quit being fucking pigs. My wife worked at id Software and, it was a very good working environment. And she had, really, really good bosses and things like that. But still, even at that legendary game studio, when she was working there, young, beautiful little build manager, she created a build manager for the entire company. But still, people would just leave little teddy bears on her desk without saying who, like that kind of shit, right? You're like, dude, this is a work environment that's really not cool. And this is one of those things, like your work environment is not your dating pool. And there are instances where, people who fall in love at work, that does happen. But by and large, get your shit done. And I think the industry has continued to take a long, hard look at the lack of diversity in it. And I think diversity brings, other perspectives to the industry from characters that aren't just, straight white dudes, because we sure have that covered.
Mm-hmm. I want to switch gears and talk about Gears. I'm sure no one's ever done that before, but you are the brainchild of Gears of War, which was no small responsibility when you think about it, because this is like a console seller. Like literally people would go out and buy Xboxes just to be able to play Gears of War.
That was the goal.
What an incredible ride. What an incredible journey. But I'd love to just hear about one of the things that was so interesting to me was, the first Gears comes out, it's a huge hit, but then the expectations to deliver again and again and again. And how did you manage that?
First off, I'm flattered that you say that, it was all me. I mean, I was certainly instrumental in, so much of what the game and the franchise was and is. But it was also, we had our version of the Beatles at that point. I had, Lee Perry, who was such an amazing game designer to work with, Chris Perna as art director. Before that, Jerry O'Flaherty, who defined the look of the first Gears, which an entire console generation then seemed to copy. Guys like Rod Ferguson, who, he didn't just make sure the game was in tip-top shape and he shipped it. He also contributed a lot creatively to the game. So we had kind of that perfect storm for a while. But, once the first one hit and it was big, Rod would gather the leads in his office and he had a process that he would call it new, better, more. We're going to do a sequel here. What's going to be new in the sequel? What's going to be better than what we did before? What are we just going to have more of? We come up with all these crazy ideas. I type up, okay, I want to see this creature, that creature. I want to see this environment, that environment. And then we need to take this one character and take Dom. And then eventually he finds his wife. The locusts have tortured her to the point where he actually has to, euthanize his own fucking wife using his big giant bolt-hawk pistol in the depths of the underground of this planet. I mean, I was in a pretty dark place apparently emotionally when I was creatively creating these games. It's somewhat like, validation all these years later. If you go to YouTube and you look up key scenes in the Gears of War franchise, such as Dominic Santiago, having to put down his wife, the character later sacrificing himself for the squad. At the end of the game where Marcus kills the queen. Spoiler, it's been years.
Spoilers, yeah.
Yeah, but, the game really resonated with people. All of the YouTube comments are like, this is the first game to ever make me cry, which makes me feel so good because at the time, we got so much shit for being this dude bro game about these bros and they're all buff and they got chainsaw guns and there's lizard men and but then suddenly in the midst of it all, people want to, being attached to these characters because it was well written and it was well acted and it wound up having an impact on people. And that's, it's not just about making them cry. It's about making people feel something. And that trickles down to when you make a good game, a good world people want to live in, and then good symbols around it. If you just Google Gears of War tattoo, Gears of War Crimson Omen, the logo with the skull and the gear around it. There's bazillions out there. And to me, the most flattering thing in the world, it's not just making a great world. It's not just making a great game or characters. And yes, making money and being known for it. But when people are willing to scar their fucking body with something that you came up with, that is the most flattering thing in the world. And then later, to then spend hundreds of hours making this cosplay for characters with all this incredible body armor and then to actually run into them at these conventions, that's also insanely flattering. And I love creating worlds. That's something I hope I get to do for the foreseeable future, right? I'm just, keep working, keep creating.
So I'd love to hear just about your experience just on the ride up, right? Because during this time, video games are becoming more and more mainstream. Obviously, you're becoming more successful. And I think in the book, you describe it as like this awkward ascent from shy, acne-riddled introvert to sports car driving, celebrity rubbing shoulders with Bill Gates and Ice Cube and Coco and everything like that. And just your life is just transforming. What was that experience like? Did you ever just stop and say, hey, this is crazy?
Well, I think it's a massive case of imposter syndrome. A lot of people have that. It's funny because I love video games, but I love TV, film, stand-up comedy, all that kind of stuff, musicals. We'll get there eventually. But, I went to the local comedy club. They actually moved to a new spot recently. We saw Anthony Jeselnik, who's, he's the king of snarky comedy, right? But the guy who opened, it's the opening of this local comedy club, and Jeselnik's kind of a big deal. And he was like, he was there to warm up the crowd. You could tell he was nervous. It was a similar thing where, I think that dude had a case of imposter syndrome. And there was so much of that where you get it. Everybody gets it in tech. It's like these people going to realize that I'm an idiot. I have no idea what I'm doing. But one of the things I learned years ago was that one of my biggest strengths is that I know my weaknesses. I'm not a good programmer. I'm not a good artist, but I know how to surround myself with the right people. That's why, again, before we went live, I was mentioning I am at my best when I can, have somebody to ping things off of creatively. If you can fight that imposter syndrome and be like, you know what? Maybe, I do have decades of making and playing video games, and maybe I have a say. Maybe I know what I like, and maybe I have my finger on the pulse. Maybe I am decent at what I do. The problem with once you get over imposter syndrome is sometimes you wind up becoming cocky and you wind up getting that kind of attitude. And I think there was some of that rubbed off when I had my own game studio with Boss Keep. And I was like, I made the Gears of War games and the Unreal games and all this stuff, and I've never really failed. And it's like, Overwatch shows up and completely crushes the cool game that we made. The internet then just, puts up YouTube think pieces thinking it's fucking hilarious in spite of the fact that my studio folding basically broke me for a year. So the big takeaway from that is imposter syndrome is going to kick in. And if you can get over it, don't wind up with cocky syndrome.
Yeah. Yeah. And it even it's just so many of the changes. I remember like just years and years ago back in the 90s and the early 2000s, like how popular E3 was, like the Electronic Entertainment Expo. And then you fast forward to today and like, this year, I think like Microsoft, Nintendo, Sony, they're not even partaking in this. And I could even tell even when you were reading the book that when you were at Boss Key, almost being frustrated with like how gamers were responding and what some of the things they wanted.
Yeah, gamers are the best and the worst at the same time, right? Like it took me many, many years to learn that if somebody were to create an account, log in and target you and sully you with every horrible curse you can have, blah, 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 that means they give a shit. That means they actually maybe play your game, maybe they like it, but they love it so much to a fault to the point where they are willing to create that account, log in and say that to you. I would rather have that, sadly, over apathy, right? I would rather have that over a tree falling in a forest and no one hears it. So as much as trolls can be very frustrating, they can be annoying. Sometimes you have to be like, okay, look, they cared enough to say this. And there's been multiple well-documented cases of public figures that have actually flipped it back around and found out that the person was going through a rough patch of their life and they actually, kind of help each other out. And then the person's like, wow, I was really being a dick. And like, yeah, you were. There actually are real people behind that keyboard and that monitor that actually have families that work their asses off to create this experience that you're shitting on right now. You just keep that in mind. To be fair, you did spend $60 or $70 on it, but just remember that there are people who made this thing, right?
Yep. Well, I will say one of the quotes that I just laughed out loud when reading the book is when you said that no one is weirder than a nerd with money. Yeah. And I'd love to know, like, what were some of the dumbest money decisions you made? We'll get to the smart ones, but I'm just curious, what was just some of the dumb shit you bought?
Oh, God. Well, the car thing, it's drilled into your head as a young man in America. This goes all the way back to, the 80s. Like, there's a famous poster that you could buy at, like, Spencer's and all that shit in the mall. It was like justification for higher education. It showed this, like, what looked like a house in, like, Malibu or the Palisades or something like that. And it had, like, a 5-car garage with all these sports cars in it, right? Which was kind of propaganda to kind of sell the college machine that an entire generation is now saddled and fucked with student loans. But we'll put that over here for another TED Talk. And so for me, growing up with Hot Wheels and later, I was addicted to my Transformers, and there were certain Transformers that were modeled after the Lamborghini Countach. America is such a car-driven country that your car is your identity. Like, when you're 16, you get your car and that's your freedom. Now you can go to the movies and you can go get your girlfriend pregnant in the backseat of the car. That was the great American dream in the 1950s and 60s. And to be fair, they had larger back seats back then. But starting off with a Lamborghini Gallardo and then upgrading it to the LP 560 Spider, and then eventually, getting an Aventador as well. And then you hit the point where, once you hit like your mid 30s, you're like, There's appreciating assets and depreciating assets. Maybe I should buy some land or real estate. There's a concept because I used to live in our little downtown Raleigh, which is, it's not exactly like New York or anything like that, but it's at a little cute little downtown with some good little restaurants and bars. And I, living down there, I was just like driving like the Lamborghinis around downtown, like, look at me. And you don't realize that you get two reactions with that type of car. You get one that's like, wow, that's a fucking cool car. That's, I want to be like that one day. And then you get the rest of people who are like, look at that asshole. And you realize, about 60 to 70% of the people are like, look at that asshole. I'm not drinking right now, but I do like to drink. And so one thing I never do is drink and drive. So I realized the true badass, calls a car and actually gets driven around town. But the cars were my thing for a while. But overall, I like to think that I've kept my spending largely in check, not really doing anything completely stupid. One of the YouTube series I wound up going down recently, I can't remember the name of the person who published it, but there's so many YouTube videos about so many rappers and so many influencers and people who made millions of dollars overnight, even lottery winners, and how they blew it. One of the best ways to stay rich is to just be somewhat stingy. I'm lucky that I married an amazing, beautiful nerd whose biggest expense is the occasional pair of Doc Martens. I was talking with your friend there, talking about Atlanta and how they're trying to make Buckhead this kind of like Beverly Hills of Atlanta, with your Prada, your Gucci and all that stuff. And I was in Hawaii visiting for a friend's wedding a few years ago. And I remember the Big Island, it's all those same luxury brands. And I think all of that is total and utter bullshit and horseshit. Once in a blue moon, if I'm going to go to like a nice wedding or an event, I've been lucky to go to a few movie premieres. Yeah, I'm going to wear a really nice Armani suit that's well fitted and made to measure. That's how I'm going to spoil myself. But 9 times out of 10, you're getting me in a t-shirt and jeans. So I think if you're a creative or if you're a person who gets a sudden windfall, the best thing you can do is, treat yourself occasionally, but save your fucking money because the world is always getting exponentially more expensive.
Yep. Well, I'll tell you, I think one of the ways that you could tell somebody really may not have that much money is if they're like decked in like Gucci, whatever it is. It's funny. I will walk in with my wife and I'll see somebody with like Gucci Prada all over them. And I'm like, that person's broke. And it's usually the ones that are like nondescript, wearing like a Honda hat and like, jean shorts. And that guy is a billionaire.
The dot-com era broke that perception of the top hat and the monocle guy going to the steakhouse that they have to require that. That's completely out the fucking window. And there's the old saying that says, we buy things we don't want to impress people that we don't like with money we don't have. I'm long past that phase and I'm comfortable fiscally. I'll be fine. But I've met people who are insanely a lot more rich than I am, actual billionaires. And the ones that I've met and hung out with, they're just chill. They're what you were saying, it's the hat, the t-shirt and jeans, and then, next thing I know, I'm getting on their Gulfstream and going to a Steelers game. And I've known people who have some money and some success and who act like they're the fucking Rockefellers. And I sit there quietly like, and they'll immediately tell you like, yeah, well, we have a beach house down at the shore. I'm like, cool. Okay. Like, why are you telling me that? Like, I just met you. Like, what the fuck, right? It's the small dog that barks a lot versus the big dog that sits in the corner and, be the big dog. Don't be the small dog with all the Gucci and Prada bullshit. It's stupid.
Agreed. And now on the flip side of that, speaking of good investments, I know you talk about that your decision to invest in Oculus and then later that gets sold. What was kind of like the thought process behind that? Was that just like you put on a VR headset and you're like, this is sick, I want to be involved, or was there more to it?
I got one right here. Oh, look at that.
Oh, Yep, the Quest.
Yeah, so that's a whole other story. Well, there's a gentleman named Brendan Uribe. He was one of the ones who fell in with Palmer Luckey. Palmer was the young wunderkind that kind of, made VR a thing again, the young 20-something, in his parents' garage in Orange County, tinkering and eventually figuring out how to make VR kind of have that resurgence because VR, if you recall, you look young, but you seem to have the experience of a person who lived through a lot of the 90s and whereas VR in the 90s, it was going to be this thing. And then, then we got this shitty game, Dactyl Nightmare, with like 8 polygons running at 5 frames a second and people were throwing up and duh. And so, but now VR is finally at the point where we gave our nieces and nephews Quest 2s for Christmas and the kids have no problem putting that headset on, playing Beat Saber and things like that, right? But I remember, hearing the stories about VR. And for me, VR is the ultimate escapism as somebody who wants to, escape to a new world as well as create worlds that other people can get to. And then I was in Mark Rain's office, the VP at Epic, and Brendan was there visiting, and he had the duct taped together version of Oculus that I literally had to hold in my head like this. And I looked around, and there was a demo from one of the id Tech software games, Rage, and I was like, I want in. And the quote that I gave Wired magazine was, I gazed into the abyss, and the abyss also gazed into me. And I knew right then and there, like they were onto something. And so I threw in, a chunk of money. In hindsight, I wish I had thrown in a lot more. Because then, Uncle Zuck shows up and throws a whole fuck ton of money at them. And, single-handedly the best investment of my entire adult life. And I still have some Facebook stock if they get their shit together. And The whole metaverse conversation is another conversation we could have. But I believe VR will get there. I don't think there's a killer app for it. I think Beat Saber is a great game, but I'm sorry, like I want to work out on my own volition. I'll do my thing. They've been selling VR. If you go around LA, you see the ads advertising it as an exercise device. Cheaper than a Peloton, right? And I'm like, no, if I want to be in my Peloton, I'll go in my Peloton. I don't want to sweat in VR. I want the version of World of Warcraft that, is that online shared experience that we can all go online in VR, look at each other's avatars and kick each other down a hill and share, loot chests and things like that. And give the Dungeons and Dragons experience, but, with our avatars in real time in VR. And somebody's working on cracking that, mark my words. I don't know who, but once they do, I think VR will finally hit the mainstream because the juice has to be worth the squeeze of putting on the fucking headset, downloading the app, updating everything, making sure it's working and tracking properly. Because if it's not, you're going to throw up. And that's one of the problems with VR is if everything's not right, the experience doesn't work perfectly. But when it does, it's utterly magical.
I'm glad, at least there's someone that's just burning billions of dollars trying to build some future in this. How far away do you think we are from Ready Player One? This is decades, right?
I still think we're way out. I mean, the Web 3.0 conversation to me right now, as of right now, feels like an attempt to fleece millions of dollars out of people who have way too much money and don't really know what they're doing with it. The amount of Web 3.0 pitches I've seen, you could sling a dead cat and just hit 15 of them right now. Because everyone's going for Decentraland. You can spend $5,000 right now and buy this completely shitty plot of land and maybe one day it'll be worth a lot. I'm like, this sounds very much like the Hamburglar type of economics. The whole crypto thing, it's like last year I put $1,000 into Ethereum and Bitcoin and then another one that I saw advertised and it's at $120 after putting $1,000 in it. And I'm like, whoop, okay, I dodged that bullet. So I think, the same thing with NFTs. NFTs are completely pointless and worthless unless you have a proper venue to show them off in. The only moment where NFTs to some extent make sense to me is when they add in perks. And the NFT to me, you look at the Bored Ape Yacht Club, stupid shit, right? And, terrible art, but people signed up for it. And the thing is when there's some sort of exclusive cool party where they're having it and there's going to be interesting guests and things like that. And the only way to get into that party is if you can show that you have the verified Bored Ape. Okay, when it acts as a boarding pass for other experiences, that's when I get it. Okay, this is verification on your phone. You actually have the proper one. That's it. As opposed to I have a monitor hanging in my house with that JPEG that somebody else can right click and do the same exact fucking thing. Who the fuck cares? So there's going to be so much bumping and elbowing trying to chase that smoke of what they think Web 3.0 is going to be. And there's going to be a lot of losers in that space and there's going to be a handful of winners. And it's going to be years before we see how the dust shakes out. I think it's going to be a lot like the mobile gaming space and same thing like Twitch, where the top 5 to 10 people or entities or companies make all the money and everybody else is left fighting over the scraps. And will we get to Ready Player One? Who knows? I think Fortnite has a good chance of getting there because they're basically saying we'll license whatever IP and throw it into our world. But just, is there a VR space that I can just hang out in that looks good, that I want to actually put my own money in? I'm all ears right now.
Yep. I want to talk about just after 20 years when you were at Epic Games, you announced your departure and then essentially go into somewhat of a retirement, then come out of retirement, start Boss Key. But I'm just curious, why leave Epic after all those years? And then, I guess there's that itch, right, to get back and kind of start your own thing.
I've been asked that over the years why I left Epic, and it was like, okay, 20 years of arguing with programmers and nonstop, interviews, it wasn't just enough for me to be there playing the game nonstop and typing up design documents of the environments I want to see in characters and working with the writers and everybody in the team making the rounds at the company every fucking day. When Tencent, a Chinese company, comes along and they buy out half of your shares and it's a really, really good amount of money, and then you look at your bank account, I'm going to have to get up and justify how I want this gun to have 3 barrels on it. It's programmer number 46. It's like, fuck it. At that point, I was kind of done. And I looked at Epic actually wound up, limping along for a little while there, after, I departed because, they didn't know what to do with the Gears franchise because I was gone, Rod Ferguson was gone, Lee Perry was gone, etc. They made a really, really cool third-person MOBA game called Paragon, which looked amazing and showed the next generation of the Unreal Engine. It didn't seem to get a lot of traction. Still is a big online community that are kind of resurrecting it, so good for them. And then they made kind of a new version of Unreal Tournament, didn't get a lot of traction. They made the first version of Fortnite, which did pretty well, called Save the World. And then the most legendary pivot in games happened where they made their own Battle Royale version. It was PUBG, but with building in a cool cartoony style. And boom, next thing you know, they're off to the races. And so more power to them. But for me, if I had hung around during that time period, I wouldn't have had it in me. I needed to just walk away, walk off, into the sunset, meander the earth like Kane in Kung Fu, as they said in Pulp Fiction. But I got fucking bored. That's the thing. There's a reason why, when your dad retires, he's in the garage, you're doing woodwork. The ideas started coming again. And then, I had an agent at the time, which sounds super shitty, but he was a really good agent. And he talked to EA, 2K, everybody involved, and ultimately settled on that company Nexon that gave us a really good deal. And we made a really, really good game for them, but the timing was bad. The marketing was uneven. and ultimately it didn't wind up doing well. But as of right now, I'm at a point where, I'm still investing in being involved in multiple different things, but I'm creating again. One of my recent tattoos I got is, from Harold and the Purple Crayon, the seminal children's book, where it's Harold, holding up, a crayon and it says create. I don't know if you can see it.
There you go. Yep.
But just, it reminds me that, there are few better highs for a creative than typing up a description of a character and sending it to a talented artist and getting that description back a couple days later, and then being able to be like, no, take the crown and modify it so it's hanging off the head slightly, but make it all emeralds instead of diamonds, and then those can be power-ups and you can place them in it, whatever kind of idea, right? That's the high that I enjoy is, turning to my wife and be like, oh my God, we got new cover art, new logo for this. What do you think? Let's send some feedback. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. To be fair, it's at noon because now I bought myself the freedom to go to bed at 3 and get up at noon. But most creatives are nocturnal. But I love the process. I'll always love it, and I'll always be making stuff. And if anybody wants to collaborate, hit me up on Twitter.
Yep. So today, like, the video game industry is massive, right? It's a $200 billion industry, like Twitch. They've got esports players. They're making 7 figures plus. Like, it's no longer the thing where I think parents seeing their kids playing video games, they're like, hey, you're wasting time. I think that's starting to kind of go by the wayside. And then even now when you're seeing like these video game adaptations like The Last of Us, right, hitting HBO. I mean, I love this. This is one of my favorite games of all time. And now like there's people in our office that get to experience this. What are your thoughts in terms of like what the future of the game industry looks like?
That's a very open-ended question. There's like 6 things there. Esports, we're at the point where these kids can make a living doing it. The problem with esports is the window for that is like 3 or 4 windows from like 18 to 24. And then by then you're a dinosaur because there's always some kid with better reaction times below you. And so we're at the point where the industry does definitely make a ton of money. Going back to The Last of Us, going to the TV adaptations, right? Like I saw an article recently that was saying like video games were thought of as children's stuff. And I'm like, that hasn't been the case for 15, 20 years, people. Like, what the fuck? Like, your average gamer right now is like 40 at this point. And yeah, you have a new younger generation of 12-year-olds that are enjoying Fortnite and 8-year-olds enjoying Roblox. But people just game. The real world can be pretty shitty and people want that escapism. And so you look at something like The Last of Us, which, you think about it, people want to escape sometimes to a shittier world, which kind of makes them feel better about their real world. It's kind of like people who watch trash shows like, MILF Island or whatnot and all those kinds of, they're like, that's a train wreck. It makes me feel better about my life. And you're like, wow, okay, interesting. But Last of Us was such amazing source material that it would be really, really bad if they fucked that up. And, 3 episodes in there, they're hitting all their marks with flying colors. And it's just, even if the game didn't exist, it's a great fucking show in and of itself, which is what any sort of game would need to be if it were to translate to, Netflix or the big screen or anything and beyond. So I think games to some extent have taken over. And I think the worm has turned, and like it goes back to even when we had Obama in office. Obama, had mentioned that he played Mortal Kombat coming up. So we've had presidents that have played video games. It's one of those things, if you want to look to where the future is going to be, look to the youth, but also look east, because there's so much that, happens in Asia, in regards to, farming games were a huge phenomenon in Asia. And then suddenly Facebook's like, let's make Farmville. And then Farmville became a thing for a while. Mobile games were a thing in Asia before they became a big thing in the West. So continue to look to the east and then continue to look at what the kids are playing, because kids have that sense of discovery. They're not, afraid to throw a VR headset on and make a fool of themselves. Whereas adults, once you hit 25, 30, you're like, oh, I don't want to do that. I'm at the point where, you need to keep that youthful mentality about yourself as you get older, and then cling to it. Because otherwise you become the get off my lawn, jaded old man. And, I'd like to think one of the reasons I look still somewhat young for being late 40s is, apart from moisturizing, is I'm a kid at heart. And I think it would benefit more people if they found themselves in touch with their inner child.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this. So if someone's listening to this podcast and they're thinking, I don't want my son or my daughter playing like these violent video games. It's going to inspire violent behavior. I mean, you created a lot of extremely violent video games. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, it goes back to like what video games was Hitler playing. It goes back to, violence has always been in human nature, and video games are still to this point targeted with that kind of question. I did, to promote the book, I did a segment with CBS this morning, and, they asked me the question. I said, I've been asked that question about violent video games and violent behavior for 30 years. And there are no definitive studies that ever say that video games cause violence, and its correlation does not equal causation. It's the whole saying of like, oh, well, there's more violent crime in the city in the summer and more ice cream is sold in the summer. Therefore, ice cream causes crime. You're like, wait, what kind of mental gymnastics are you doing now? You look at the amount of people globally that play video games, many, many violent video games out there, and the amount of people that are committing these violent acts. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of the massive shootings that are in America, because that's a multifaceted problem between mental health, gun access, all of that. That's a whole other conversation. But video games do not cause people to act out. If anything, they are cathartic. It goes back to when I was a teenager being frustrated with my grades in high school, and I come home and shotgun a bunch of demons in the face in Doom, and ultimately I'd feel better. It was cathartic. It was that valve release, and that's what video games do provide. They provide that release.
So Cliff, I know you mentioned that now you've earned the freedom to wake up at noon. What's a day in the life look like now? I mean, I know you're the co-owner of a few restaurants, you're an investor, Broadway producer, producing musicals. Like, what's a day in the life?
So like I said, I get up at noon, and I earn that right because I believe that I fucking hate mornings. I've always hated mornings ever since I was a kid in New England, going to school in the bus. It's New England in the winter and it's still dark out and you're like falling asleep in the bus and falling asleep in homeroom. Certain people are just wired to be day people or morning people or night people. And my wife and I, we're nocturnal, right? One of the many reasons we don't have any kids. So, get up, take care of the dogs and just, check email and then look for the various things that have come in and the various projects that I'm working on and send feedback. Deal with IRL BS is what I call it, the kind of stuff of day-to-day things. And then ultimately, once my wife and I get a lot of stuff done, she's doing the Twitch streaming thing, Twitch TV/Lee Lauren, L337 Lauren. I started to get some good traction there. And, then go out, go see a movie, go out with friends, and just live our life and come home and play video games. And so I've created this perfect, ultimate kind of, nerd setup for myself between playing video games with my wife or watching comic book movies or comic book shows like The Boys, and then just noodling on things. I have like 6-7 IPs that I'm working on, and I'll wake up. My reminder for myself is to email myself. So I'll pick up my phone and email myself and say, okay, the main character is a chef and he can get upgrades by cooking things better and then giving them to his friends and winning people over to build his army, whatever, right? And then, those ideas stick, and then I go to my computer and put it in a text document, and then it eventually becomes a Word document. And then when I feel confident in an idea, I contract artists, maybe do a little bit of AI art to kind of sell the idea and keep having all these plates spinning. So one thing I am working on is a comic book. I've teased on my Twitter feed that I'm working on a project with a dog. And so kind of put the two and two together that, it is a comic book that hopefully will be coming out this summer. I can't say much more about it, but my question is what happens when all the kids who love Paw Patrol start getting a little bit older and Paw Patrol is no longer cool for them? So I guess that's one of my strengths overall that I've had over the years. That is, I'm a creative person, but I also like to look at where the market's going. And, when we did, Unreal, we zigged when Quake had zagged. I creatively always try and do things that I see an opening in the market. And I just think there's room for a really, really badass dog world out there. That's PG-13, not R, but still there's something there that could be big, as well as other stuff that I'm noodling on.
I think people love the PG-13. And thank you, by the way, for the shout out of The Boys, because I think I read this week that The Boys on Amazon was more popular than like any of the Marvel shows on Disney+. So I think people just want to see something, a little bit more mature.
I love, a good comic book movie, right? Like, I watched, the majority of the MCU, the TV shows, I watched some of them, I loved WandaVision because WandaVision was different, right? Like if I see a superhero origin story and then something happens, there's a big bad and it ultimately ends in the Act 3 big CG fight, the more CG in your superhero TV show or movie, the more I tune out. And I was talking about this on Twitter the other day where they're anticipating the new Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania is going to make tons of money, and sure, more power to him. But for me, I'm like, and I love Paul Rudd, and I enjoyed the first couple films with him. I think Ant-Man's a cool character, the abilities to grow and shrink in the quantum universe and things like that. I think that's all compelling and cool. I just saw the last trailer I saw for it. They're introducing a new big bad, okay, and I didn't see anything that I could really quote out of the new trailer. And for me, if I see a trailer that's 90% CG and no like cool character moments, going to horror for a second, you look at Megan recently and there's so many like quotable moments from the trailers alone and the Megan dance that went viral on TikTok. You look at the Evil Dead Rise coming out and there's the line from the trailer where the little girl says, I know you'll be a good parent because you're good at lying to kids. That's just a great little moment right there. And on top of all the blood and violence, it's like, if you don't have those moments, if you don't have Avengers Age of Ultron, Captain America sitting there talking to Tony Stark and fighting while they're chopping wood. And then you can see Cap getting frustrated. He breaks the wood apart, which reminds you that he's a super soldier. They're not wearing their super outfits. There's no big aliens attacking from the sky. It's just these two characters who are slowly starting to have ultimate dueling ideologies that will result in a superhero civil war. That's compelling shit to me. The more you throw CG enemies at the characters, I don't, fine. That is what it is. Like I don't really want that. I love the compelling character moments, and that's what makes it work. For me, at least. So we'll see where things go. But The Boys is fucking awesome. I loved it since the comic books. I love Garth Ennis, and they're doing a fantastic job with it.
Yep. So just to close this out, this being the Game Changing Attorney podcast, you're certainly a game changer, but what does being a game changer mean to you?
For me, being a game changer means seeing the world around you, understanding that it's ultimately just systems and figuring out how to manipulate that world. And I think that's one of the reasons people love video games, because they get a set of rules, they learn those rules, and then they learn how to master that rule. The same thing can be applied to meat space, the real world that we live in. So be it video games, be it learning how the machinations of how Broadway works, from the capitalization of Broadway shows to the restaurant industry and real estate and relationships, dating and personal friendships and things like that. Everything is just systems. And in order to change the game, you have to master those systems.
I hope you enjoyed revisiting this episode of the Game Changing Attorney Podcast with our guest, Cliff Bleszinski, and have gained new insights from our timeless conversation. If you found this episode valuable, here are 3 free ways that I can help you grow your law firm. Number 1, download the first chapter of my book absolutely free at GameChangingAttorney.com. Number 2, you can shoot me a text at 404-531-7691, and I'll answer any question that you've got for me. And finally, number 3, if you can leave this podcast a 5-star review, it'll help us gain access to more influential thought leaders and bring their lessons learned here to you. For more information on our interview with Cliff Bleszinski, see the show notes for this episode in your podcast app or visit legalpodcast.com.